Previously on the American Century, we discussed the first New Deal and how Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected at maybe the worst time in America's economic history. There's 25% unemployment rate. And by the time FDR is elected, the Depression has really gone on for about 3 years, really, and nothing is getting better. And what we've talked about is that Herbert Hoover does try to directly intervene, but it just doesn't work. That it's just really, instead of Herbert Hoover just not doing anything at all, what happens is he just is pathetically undergunned. He just doesn't do nearly enough, even though he does more than any president in American economic history up to that point. So I think what that says is it says more about the Great Depression than it does about Herbert Hoover, really. And so we talked about in the first New Deal that FDR is really trying to, one, make sure the banking system of the United States does not die, because that very much could have happened. And what I didn't tell first period, but I think I told third and fourth period, is that when FDR gets into office, he institutes a 100 during the first 100 days, he implements a banking holiday where the banks close down. And the idea is that, well, if the banks are closed down, people can't go and withdraw their savings. And during that time period, during that banking holiday, Roosevelt makes a direct appeal to the American people to try to build up some confidence in the banking system. And I guess it's one of the Hollywood moments of the Great Depression, because when the banking holiday is over and the banks reopen, more people put money into banks than withdraw money from the banks. And that is significant in and of itself. Again, this goes back to that whole idea that, confidence in the economy is not just some kind of feel-good, fuzzy idea, that it actually does have some economic benefit. We talked about the fact that he creates the FDIC, where the federal government insures the private savings accounts of individuals up to about $2,500, which, I'm going to ballpark it at this point because I don't have my inflation calculator on me, but I'll say that's probably around $40,000 to $50,000 in probably more like $50,000 to $60,000 actually in today's purchasing terms. So, it's quite a bit of money. Is it obviously the entirety of your life savings? Perhaps no, but is better than those case studies we talked about where somebody could lose their lifetime accumulation of wealth in one day just because they were last in line, or maybe the middle of a line, trying to withdraw their money from the bank. We also talked about the fact that FDR is, come on, slide, work with me here. The fact that unemployment is something that FDR is very much concerned with, and the fact that uh, Keynesians are, and FDR, in fact, they're concerned primarily with unemployment. That unemployment is a much bigger threat to the economy than simply running up a large deficit or running up the national debt. And to that end, he establishes various federal programs. I know there's a smorgasbord of letters, the alphabet soup. Um, and again, I'm much more concerned that you're aware of the significance of each of these programs. On one of the practice AP tests, actually, there is a question on showing a picture of workers. Actually, let me bring up that picture because I put it in the slides. There's this picture right here. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor of shirtless people shoveling dirt. And the question went something like, what does this, which alphabet soup program does this picture best depict? And the answer is the Civilian Conservation Corps, because that's the corps tasked with basically maintaining and expanding national parks, etc. And, as it might suggest, you know, the federal work programs like the CCC, the CWA, and we'll be talking about a couple others like the WPA, et cetera. These are different than some of the other programs like the AAA, like FERA, et cetera, because instead of subsidies, in other words, basically unemployment compensation in a sense, these other two programs are meant to give people employment. But again, is it good employment? Is this necessarily something that uh, you know interesting work that's incredibly important? And the answer is probably not. It depends upon the project, but it's sometimes you would get those situations where you would build roads to nowhere. You would just have federal projects for the sake of having federal projects because it's thought that if the federal government does that, then that puts people to work, and if you put people to work and give them a reasonable salary, that money trickles down into the economy. Both, if you not to be incredibly confusing, but both of these dominant economic theories use some kind of trickle down theory. The end goal is for the money for money to eventually go into the broader national economy. It's just the way that it comes into the economy is different between, for example, the Keynesians and the supply siders. The supply siders, well, it's thought that that more money will trickle into the economy if you give money to the producers, the factories, the financial system, whatever else. These are the engines of growth. The Keynesians believe that the best way for money to trickle into the broader national economy and to jumpstart it is to give that kind of money to consumers who then turn around and spend it. It should be noted, by the way, that generally when you hear the term trickle down, though, you're really just referring to the supply siders. But where we left off is we were talking about the popular conception of FDR and how we see FDR through the prism of the Great Depression, and we see him through the prism of the Second World War as this sort of saintly, grandfatherly figure. And you personally might not think that, and of course, I'm sure that for a lot of you, this is maybe the first time you've ever really studied FDR in any real detail, besides the fact that his face is on the dime. But I think what's interesting to note, though, is that that generation that grew up with FDR, I think it's fair to say, definitely held this point of view. Again, particularly that younger generation. But for a lot of his contemporaries, FDR was more like Che Guevara. He was somebody who was seen as a socialist and a communist. I mean, those words were floated quite a bit. And the reason for this is because you begin to see some growing New Deal resistance. You see resistance from both what I guess you would call small C conservatives, and you see that resistance coming actually from individuals who are, I hesitate to use the word progressive because I don't think you can describe somebody like Huey Long and Charles Coughlin as progressive in the way we would think of them. But the practical fact is that there was some debate as to whether the New Deal was too hot, too cold, or just right. The Supreme Court of the United States would say that the New Deal was far too hot, that it was trying to do far too much. FDR would say the New Deal was just right. But he would because, that's kind of his baby. And then you have people like, for example, Charles Coughlin, Francis Townsend, to some extent, the growth of some of the labor unions, the CIO, for example. They would say that the New Deal does far too little, that it doesn't go nearly far enough. So I think for first period, I went over this to some extent. For third and fourth period, I think this is fairly new information. But the thing to remember is that the New Deal expansion is justified constitutionally due to the the Interstate Commerce Clause. And if you don't remember rather, what that means, it is that Congress has, or the federal government generally, through Congress, has the sole power to regulate commerce between the states. So if you've forgotten your civics material. Basically, the Interstate Commerce Clause is a part of the Constitution that really serves as the bedrock for uh, federal expansion. To some extent, most of the federal government's contemporary powers come from the Interstate Commerce Clause, and this is why really. Um, but the thing is, these New Deal policies were justified under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Even though I think it's probably fair to say that certainly, the founding fathers probably intended the Interstate Commerce Clause so that they could mediate between a trade dispute between North Carolina and Virginia, for example, not so FDR could create a massive organization that employs 4 million people and pays farmers to ostensibly not grow as much stuff. So it is a radical redefinition of the scope of federal power. And not too surprisingly, the individuals tasked with trying to interpret the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and more generally the judiciary, certainly didn't seem all that sympathetic at first to those interpretations of the Constitution. You have the Schechter versus United States case, Butler versus United States, where they're all revolving around whether or not FDR's New Deal policies are constitutional. And the court initially comes in and says that no, in fact, and specifically the constitutionality of the AAA, the farm subsidy program, essentially. Uh, the discussion revolves around whether that's constitutional, and whether the minimum wage. Remember the NRA, not that NRA, but the um, National Recovery Administration. Uh, they enact for a brief period of time a minimum wage, and in Butler versus United States, that is struck down. And to some extent, these policies are at the very heart of FDR's New Deal. And so what happens is that there is a scheme, a plan that FDR puts forward to pack the court with as many with up to 15 other justices. The idea being that he could get around the conservative resistance to the New Deal if he appoints more justices. Because remember that under the Constitution, the judiciary is independent, but FDR has the power to appoint whoever he wants to the Supreme Court. Now, for reasons we'll talk about later, just because the president has the right to appoint Supreme Court justices does not necessarily mean that the Supreme Court is necessarily going to adopt the ideology of the president that appoints them. Because one of the nice things about being a Supreme Court justice is once you get there, presuming you don't do anything illegal, like, become a Nazi supervillain or something, you can pretty much do or say anything you want up to a certain point. As presidents have sometimes found out, much to their annoyance. But at the same time, this is a situation where FDR is reaching so far that Republicans and Democrats, it should be said, become very, very frightened. This seems to be a step way too far. But as I intimated, not only do you have conservative resistance to the New Deal on one side, you actually have people who are saying that FDR is just not going far enough. And you see that in several different areas. We have Father Charles Coughlin, who is a bit of a populist. Again, I think that the mold to think of is a William Jennings Bryan type individual. And like FDR, he has his own radio program. And Coughlin is really, to some extent, he is a product of that sort of socially conservative populist streak that we talked about during the late 19th century, early 20th century. And basically, his point of view is that we need a gold and silver standard. And we need much more federal support for poor people. And by the way, Charles Coughlin also believes that that FDR needs to go after the money powers. And by money powers. Who he is really talking about, or the group he's talking about, are the Jews, which, by the way, is something another German fellow is beginning to talk about, yeah, a continent away. You also have, probably more dangerously, Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, and I think I mentioned the first period yesterday that you can basically conceptualize Huey Long as, in some ways, the Emperor of Louisiana, and he actually has a share our wealth plan by which he anticipates paying a stipend to $5,000, up to $5,000 per household, as well as a $2,500 minimum wage, at least a $2,500 annual minimum wage. And Huey Long is somebody who has become so powerful and it becomes so vicious about targeting his political opponents that in 1935, right when it looks like Huey Long might be a presidential challenger to FDR within the Democratic Party, he is assassinated by the nephew, or son-in-law, I think it's the son-in-law, of a judge from Louisiana who is removed from power by Huey Long. You also have Dr. Francis Townsend, who is going to be a champion of the elderly, and he is going to publicly advocate through radio addresses the passage of of old age pensions. And but this is going to be very important in just a moment, actually. But also, what's going on is that same revolutionary atmosphere that we talked about within in the Great Depression during 32, 33. That really hasn't gone away to a large extent. I mean, Senator Huey Long, to a certain extent, is a byproduct uh, of this period of radicalization, because what tends to happen as a general rule of thumb is that when people are down on their luck, when they have nothing left to lose, then suddenly the radical groups tend to become much more popular. Because here's the thing: centrist groups, centrist political parties, Republicans, Democrats, etc., their proposed solution to any crisis is probably going to be, well, we just need to tweak it. Radical groups, by their definition, want a radical change. They want, instead of tweaking the game, there just needs to be a new game. And so people who are down on their luck, and lost their homes, are maybe worried about starvation, and as we've talked about, that does happen during the Great Depression, then maybe radical groups are going to offer attractive solutions for a lot of people, even though they might seem otherwise irrational. You can best detect this sort of growing radicalism, this sort of pseudo-revolutionary movement, in what organized labor does. And we talked about how in the 1920s there's this great period of prosperity, and you have the growth of welfare capitalism, where employers are offering more benefits, pension programs, et cetera, to their employees. So generally, during the Great Depression, or in the lead up to the Great Depression, labor unions or just organized labor in general becomes far less popular, far less powerful. And what starts to happen is that during the Great Depression itself, if you remember that the powerful unions are the craft unions, like the American Federation of Labor. Unskilled labor, for most of American history, unskilled labor has just been out of luck. And so, what begins to happen, though, as a result of radicalization, as a result of federal legislation like the National Industrial Recovery Act, it's perceived that the federal government is giving its blessing to all labor unions to organize, unskilled or skilled. But there's a problem. There's a problem. One, One, the problem is among businesses who don't like this concept. Who don't want to face the prospect of unskilled labor organizing. But there's also a problem within labor itself, because remember, the big game on the block is that old Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And one of the things that happens is that um, the Committee for Industrial Organization, led by John Lewis, breaks off, or actually forms after he breaks off from the AFL. Famously, I think that the formation of the CIO was in the aftermath of a fist fight that Lewis gets into with a major leader of the AFL. And Lewis himself, he was a leader of the United Mine Workers. He is somebody who's a champion of unskilled labor. And what happens during this time period is labor stages, and by labor I mean unskilled labor, stage several very successful strikes. You actually have strikes against U.S. Steel that are fairly successful. You also have strikes perpetrated by the United Auto Workers um, against General Motors. And this is a very new type of strike, or I think it might be the first time this striking method is actually used. I could be wrong though. But remember that the way a strike typically works is that you have workers form picket lines, and essentially this will prevent, well, it's hoped it will prevent new workers from coming in and replacing the striking workers, and it'll also put lots of pressure on the corporation to hear the demands of striking workers. Well, what the idea behind the sit-in is this: instead of going in and striking and picketing outside of the plant, maybe the idea is to go into work as normal and everybody go into their jobs, into their positions, and then just refuse to do anything. That way it's much more difficult and much more awkward for striking workers to be replaced. But because, you just think about it from kind of a common sense perspective. If you are striking outside a plant, the only thing you need is you just need to hire enough Pinkertons or strike busters or whoever else to break through that picket line. If you have sit-ins, then what that requires you to do is to go in and arrest people who really aren't picketing, really aren't causing a scene. They're just sitting at their workstations passively, doing nothing. And one, that's unpopular when, just to arrest people who are literally sitting in and, being passive, not doing anything. It's kind of the Mahatma Gandhi lesson. You don't. It's difficult to respond to passive aggression with overt aggression. You just look bad. But the other thing is this: if it's just hard practically to remove every single person. Whereas with a picket line, all you need to do is just break through a few people. So this is a great way for unskilled labor to make a definite impact. Um, Now, you still have feuding within the CIO, it has to be said. John Lewis is, one of the things that makes him very effective, unlike, for example, Terrence Powderly, etc., is he is willing to get down and dirty and, fight with people he hates. But the problem is that somebody who's very, very effective at fighting with, for example, leaders of the AFL or business leaders is also going to be very effective in fighting with people he also has to work with. And, it seems like during the late 30s, early 40s, the CIO would have made a great soap opera with the ego fights, etc. But it is the case that you have a massive increase in the success of organized labor, and even some of the defeats of labor. You have the little steel strikes Basically, strikes that are perpetrated against smaller steel mills that are not U.S. Steel. Remember that old Carnegie U.S. Steel is still the big game in town in terms of the steel industry. One of the things that happens because of that is that in striking for higher wages and better working conditions in 1937, the owners of the steel mill kind of overreact. Um, and they, as there's a strike that is held on Memorial Day in 1937, and the company, I think the company security force, it might be the National Guard. Actually, let me double check because I think that's kind of significant in and of itself. Well, in either case, what you have is the company overreacts, and a gunfight breaks out, and up to 10 people are actually killed. And so the irony is that the steel strikes in 1937 are unsuccessful, at least in the short term, but in the long term, uh, what it means is that organized labor now has stronger support in government and stronger support amongst the population, because like Haymarket Square is something that demonized organized labor in the 1880s. This is something that makes organized labor a bit more sympathetic. But all of these things together, this sort of growing radicalism, and the fact that it has to be said that FDR is up for re-election in 1936. I mean, you would love to believe that politicians all act in the best interest of the country and out of the out of humanitarianism, but the reality is that FDR knows that he's up for re-election. He also knows that he faces a challenge from um, people like Coughlin, people like Huey Long. Huey Long is assassinated in 35, but the fact is that a one of his political disciples is um, appointed in his place, and that Coughlin, Townsend, um, basically the Huey Long voter bloc, they're all coming together and challenging the New Deal for not going far enough. On the other hand, you have a progressive Republican who is challenging the New Deal for being an example of extreme overreach. So, what FDR is trying to do is this: he is trying to head off the criticism he is getting for not going nearly far enough, especially amongst by individuals like Long, etc. And what he does is he actually passes the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history. And I think that's the way he justifies passing this is kind of interesting because, typically the government doesn't really tax very much unless the United States is at war. And typically, I mean, the relationship is that the federal government doesn't really do much unless we are at war. Um, the way FDR conceptualizes this is that in his appeal for the New Deals, is that he analogizes fighting the Great Depression with fighting a major war. And one of the other tenets of what's called the Second New Deal, again, this is in 35, 36, is the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. And what this does is it's a bit similar to something we've already talked about, the National Labor Relations Board in World War I. But this is, again, in peacetime. In other words, we are seeing some of the same wartime government apparatus in peacetime that otherwise we'd have to look at a war to find. And what this does is it really forces businesses and labor unions to come together and engage in some kind of bargaining process. And the thing to keep in mind is that in a lot of businesses, the first recourse, the first response oftentimes to dealing with organized labor is to refuse to bargain whatsoever, is to not recognize them. So the very fact that business and labor are forced to come to a table at all to start talking is, in many cases, it's a positive development for organized labor. But the big one, the one that you should know for the AP test, for any history class, and based upon the fact that it's in like the reptile brain of our contemporary society's architecture, politically, socially, culturally, whatever else, is the Social Security Act of 1935. Now, this establishes Social Security. But I think that one of the things is that we can easily take that for granted, what that actually means. I don't really see how you can take it for granted because I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Yeah, you see that if you're working or anything else, you see that it is some number that kind of comes out of your paycheck right there. And the idea of Social Security is this. It is, at the end of the day, a massive insurance pool because remember the context of what's going on. You have the fact that you have a Great Depression, massive unemployment, and you have the economic crisis is hitting, for example, the elderly disproportionately hard. And if you think about this, if working people who would otherwise have good paying jobs are finding it hard. What about people who are disabled? What about people who are considered unemployable? I mean, if you think about this, this is something that just came to me right now, but FDR is a bright person, and he was fortunate enough to be elected president of the United States. But maybe in the back of his mind, he's also conscientious of the fact that he won the genetic lottery. He was born to a very wealthy family, a family that could afford the best possible opportunities for him educationally and so on. And that if maybe FDR did not win the genetic lottery and was hit with polio, maybe in midlife with a working class job, maybe FDR could have been one of those unemployables, people who were unable to participate in a manual labor job during the Great Depression. I might be reaching there a little bit, but hey, it's probably something that enters into his mind at some point. So what it does is this. That's sort of the idealized version, by the way, but the practical reality is that the Social Security Act of 1935 is also something to head off the criticisms of Huey Long, Francis Townsend, etc. And it establishes this. Remember, by the way, that this is something that progressives had pushed for in the early 1900s and had really not succeeded on, at least on the national level. They had proposed, and I think there were some state Social Security programs, but there's been nothing that had been implemented at the national level. Remember, TR pushes for it because with his New Nationalism platform, but nothing at the end of it, nothing comes of it because, of course, TR is not elected. So Social Security does this. The idea of Social Security is that everybody who is working pays into this insurance pool through a payroll tax. A payroll tax is basically a tax on working. If you work, you're going to pay this tax. And that's why it's called a payroll tax, because nobody likes the idea of having to actually pay a tax to work, because nobody likes the idea of actually having to pay money to do something they don't really want to do in the first place. So there's a little bit of marketing spin there, probably. But the idea is that people who do work will pay for those who can't. And the idea is that you pay in, but eventually you pay. You hopefully get paid out. And the way you get paid out is this: if you are somebody who's elderly, you have the right to collect a pension over 65. And these benefit payments would only be about $22 per month, which even at that point is not an incredibly high number. But the fact is that it is a sort of a massive improvement again, if you think that this is a good thing, and of course this is a still to some extent one of the more controversial parts of the New Deal today, but um, it was an improvement over nothing. I mean, there was nothing like this instituted at a national level beforehand. If you wanted a pension or benefits or anything similar, you had better have a good employer, or you had better set aside a lot of money, because otherwise you were more, for the most part, on your own. It also provides some. You can also withdraw benefits if you are experiencing a period of unemployment, or if you are disabled, and what people who were called the unemployables by during the time period. But if you think about it, this whole concept of Social Security, the fact that at the end of the day, you need society's help, and that's really what Social Security is. It is society collectively paying in for those who would otherwise be on their own financially. That whole concept is something that Americans still today, I think, have some difficulty with. And I think every society has issues there, one way or the other. But I think the United States, it particularly does, because we are a frontier, rugged, individualist nation, for better or for worse. And the Social Security kind of flies in the face of hundreds of years of conditioning to some extent. And so it's one of the reasons I think that it's probably so much more controversial even to this day in the United States, in a way that it really isn't, for example, in Germany, or the states who passed Social Security to begin with. It should be noted that another um, plank of the Second New Deal is, you see the expansion of um, another organization designed to employ people. And whereas previous organizations focus on giving people jobs for manual labor, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, is to some extent a way for the federal government to employ and subsidize artists, writers, people, I guess what you would say, in the creative sectors of the economy. And I mean, for a historian, this is great. I can say that kind of selfishly, because some of the best material, some of the best photographs, some of the from this time period come from artists, writers, photographers, yeah, excuse me, photographers, etc., working under the WPA. Now, with the Second New Deal, um, these are things, especially with the Social Security Act, that become part of America's societal fabric. And of course, Social Security is, the passage in 1935. That's really just the beginning. And what we're going to see, not to spoil things too much, is that this sort of sorry, I was about to say Great Society, but this Second New Deal and the spirit of it will be expanded throughout the 40s, 50s, and especially once you get to the 60s and Lyndon Johnson, you're going to see it expanded again to encompass Medicare and Medicaid. We're also going to talk about why that it was also problematic, because the FDR had the benefit of enacting these programs when the United States was purely concerned with domestic problems. The problem with LBJ is that he is enacting he's pushing for his great society, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., while the United States is fighting the Vietnam War, which, it's kind of hard to. I empathize. I'm not very good at multitasking, and I guess neither is the federal budget of the United States. But in 1936, what happens is a seismic political shift. You have what's called the New Deal Coalition. And by the way, this isn't an official term. Actually, let me go ahead and kind of skip ahead. I have a slide based upon sort of the legacy of the New Deal, and it's really this. The New Deal coalition is a realignment, as we'd call it, is what we call it in political science terms, of the major voting blocks. Because if you remember that in general, the Republicans and Democrats didn't really divide based upon whether or not they were progressive. That the Progressive Party was really not, well, actually, no, there just was no Progressive Party. You had progressive Republicans, a la Theodore Roosevelt. You had progressive Democrats, a la Woodrow Wilson. But the parties didn't really divide along ideology. And what happens is this. The After the New Deal, there's a trend increasingly for the Democratic Party to be the small p progressive party. Now, that's an evolution in progress. And of course, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you will still see progressive Republicans. Most famously, Nelson Rockefeller, but also, arguably, I think it deserves to be said, Richard Nixon, which is kind of hard to and awkward for us to think about today because we don't associate Nixon and his being kind of a sociopath with being a progressive candidate. But in some respects, he does kind of come out of that school. But what you start to see is one, the Democratic Party becomes the progressive party, the party that social progressives start to join in large numbers. And the other thing is this: you start to see African Americans for the first time voting Democrat. Because if you remember, one of the big legacies of Reconstruction is that African Americans, when they could vote, would vote for Republicans because the Democrats were the party of the South, the party of the elite planners, and the African Americans and the elite planners. I think it's probably fair to say that they had conflicting interests there. Um, the irony is that because of the New Deal, because of the fact that you have AAA, because of the fact that FDR is certainly not somebody who is going to change the world for African Americans. I mean, we're still decades away from the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 64, 65, etc. But FDR is still at the same time far more receptive to African Americans than, for example, Woodrow Wilson, which I know that's kind of a low threshold. But the fact is that he encourages the New Deal, or rather, he entices African American support for the New Deal because at the end of the day, even though FDR is not going to again change the world for African Americans, he is offering them aid in a way that the Republicans are just not. Remember, the big criticism of the Republican Party is under Herbert Hoover is not that Hoover did nothing, but what Hoover did was his federal aid was directed toward business and institutions rather than people. It is also, we'll talk about this a bit more later, but there are also, even though FDR is is probably personally ambivalent towards African Americans, there are many people within his cabinet who take a much more active role. But you have this African Americans included in a voting bloc with labor unions, basically blue collar workers, and white Southerners, white mostly farmers, etc. And obviously, there are some interesting contradictions here. Obviously, you can start to see that there is a lot of differences between the groups and their interests. But it should be noted that because of this more active government, more pervasive government, this is a coalition that basically stays together on up through the 1960s and debatably even beyond that. So you have the New Deal, and everything should be hunky dory. But the irony is that despite all of the pains Roosevelt takes in creating the New Deal, The fact is that in 1937, when the economy looks pretty good, uh, what Roosevelt is, or rather, when the economy starts to recover, what happens is that um, people within Roosevelt's administration, like his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, they begin expressing some concern to Roosevelt that the boogeyman is now inflation rather than unemployment. And one of the big causes of inflation is, just to sort of simplify a lot of macroeconomic discussion, is debt, is excessive government spending. And so the idea is that Roosevelt um, is encouraged to cut his very expensive New Deal programs, cut employment, etc., so that you reduce inflation. Because according to Roosevelt and some members of his cabinet, things are looking pretty good. Maybe we don't need some of those. And I think maybe the best analogy to think about is something like this. Um, if I were to go to the doctor, which, my wife sometimes nags me to do, little cough or sniffle, go to the doctor. Okay. Well, there are two, whenever you get sick, there are two general options. You can, hunker down, or you can take medicine. If you hunker down, it might be a miserable week or two, but generally, if you can survive that miserable week or two and not die or get even worse, then maybe your immune system will adjust and maybe you'll be stronger for it. In a purely sort of Darwinistic calculus, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that kind of thing. On the other hand, you can go and take medication. Now, here's the problem. So you go for, the flu or something. I don't know. Pick your illness of choice. And, if it's like most doctor visits, what's going to happen is you're going to go there for about 10 to 15 minutes, and the doctor is going to write you a script for a buttload of antibiotics. Now, okay, so you got antibiotics, and, hopefully, provided you don't have some kind of antibiotic resistant superbug, perhaps that's going to actually work. Now, but here, so you go through and you can do the full treatment, and maybe that will cure you. On the other hand, what is going to happen if you stop taking your medication right in the middle of your treatment? If you're like me, you are absent-minded and you forget to or something. Well, what often happens is that the pathogen in your body adapts, and sometimes it becomes stronger, and conditions can get even worse. Well, the New Deal, that's the antibiotic. And what happens is the country stops taking it right in the middle. And so you start to see the WPA cut. You start to see some of these these agencies that Roosevelt creates to increase employment. These are cut. And you can see that you start to see that unemployment problem again. 5.5 million people lose their jobs, and national productivity it's cut by about 40%. And the funny thing is that for a lot of people, though, some of the worst years of the Great Depression are not 1932, 1933, so on. Some of the worst years of the Great Depression are actually, for example, 1939, 1938. Just think about this. You've had almost 10 years of depression at this point, close to an entire decade. And it is 1938. Roosevelt has just won re-election, and nothing looks like it's changed. That things are just as bad as they were in 1932, 1933. So, in the middle of this, you have the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, almost in response to this economic catastrophe. And this actually does several very important things, because remember, we had a national minimum wage beforehand enacted by the National Recovery Administration, and before it was struck down by the Supreme Court in the Butler case. Well, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you actually have a reestablished national minimum wage, but also a 40-hour work week and a limitation on child labor. Yay for the kiddies! So we're kind of going over the impact on the second New Deal. And for one thing, it's actually kind of something that comes a bit out of left field, is that it actually makes a huge impact from Native Americans. Because if you remember, the last time we really discussed Native Americans is with the passage of the Dawes Act. And if you remember the Dawes Act in 1887, I think, or 1889, double check. But anyway, the Dawes Act is, if you remember, the whole point of the Dawes Act is to get Native Americans to leave the reservation and to abolish sort of collective tribal ownership. Yeah, 1887. I shouldn't doubt my gut instinct. I'm doing everything I tell you guys never to do on a test, which is don't doubt your gut instinct. But yeah, again, if you remember, the Dawes Act abolishes tribal ownership of land in favor of private ownership. And so what happens is, one, you have the establishment of, you have the Indian Reorganization Act, which will actually, it completely reverses the Dawes Act, and it restores collective ownership rights. And what we mean is that land can now be owned based upon the tribe's ownership versus personal ownership. And what you start to see in the aftermath is that for Native Americans, the land acreage that they own is increases exponentially. Now, still, it's land that's not all that generally is seen as not very particularly valuable. But if you just look at living conditions on the whole for Native Americans after this, it's much better. And of course, this is where I also say that Native Americans are still during this time period, and again in modernity, they're still living in substantial poverty. But still, this is definitely a positive development, I think you could say, for Native Americans. Now, a moment ago, when I mentioned that the New Deal coalition is increasingly going to become a progressive organization, don't necessarily make the mistake of assuming that they are progressive in all things. One of the things that happens in the New Deal, and when actually really in the Great Depression, is that you see massive unemployment across the board. And one of FDR's cabinet appointees, the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, is actually the first female to have a position in an American president's cabinet. And one of the fascinating things about Frances Perkins is that she and the National Recovery Administration encourage women to essentially leave their jobs and sort of return to the household, sort of return to back to the separate spheres of the separate spheres during the sort of a throwback to the cult of domesticity to some extent, in favor of their husbands, in favor of men going into the workforce, etc. And of course, the interesting thing is that, of course, this is going to be challenged by, among other people, Eleanor Roosevelt, who's going to play an important role in FDR's administration. Mostly because FDR doesn't necessarily, they have a complicated relationship. FDR doesn't necessarily care passionately about women's rights in the same way he doesn't really care passionately about African American rights. In a way but Eleanor Roosevelt definitely does. And the reason why she's important is that she is very, very popular and has national recognition in a way that first ladies really haven't beforehand. I mean, even Edith Wilson, who was very, very powerful, didn't really have national recognition. Eleanor Roosevelt was powerful in her own right. And I think that she kind of needed to be. She was from a very intensely political family. And by intensely political, I mean she's Theodore Roosevelt's niece, for crying out loud. But the other thing is that, and I don't want to make this a historical discussion of the tawdry bits of presidential history, but the fact is that uh, FDR was a bit of a schmoozer, and particularly a schmoozer with the ladies. And the thing is that he was a schmoozer and wasn't particularly discreet about it. He had a mistress who was his secretary, and actually she would remain his mistress until his the day he died. In fact, quite awkwardly, when he actually does die at his vacation home in 1945 in Georgia, forget the city name, but his mistress is right there at his side. Eleanor is not. And it should be noted that Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR, they had a fantastic political relationship, political alliance, but they were two very, very different people, very distant from one another, and just different psychological makeups. And the thing is that um, when FDR comes home at some point, he comes home from Washington to New York, where the family home was. Eleanor Roosevelt is going through his things, looking at it, and after putting away his stuff, his luggage, etc., she finds in what just in kind of plain sight, letters from his mistress. And one of the things is that their marriage almost ends. And I think that ultimately there's a lot of discussion, by the way, within the Roosevelt family as to what actually happens. There's discussion that FDR wanted to leave Eleanor but couldn't because a divorced politician would be unelectable, and the fact that his mistress was a practicing Roman Catholic, and she would not marry, or she would not marry a divorced husband. Just a lot of soap opera-ish stuff. But the fact is that from that point onward, there's sort of a tacit agreement that Eleanor Roosevelt would work on her own policies, her own agendas, and FDR would support her, and he would give her a great deal of autonomy. So, ironically, while this was sort of the death of a personal relationship to some extent, it signaled the beginnings of a pretty unique political relationship. And of course, one of the other major impacts of the New Deal was in the form of organized labor. We talked about the Wagner Act, the National. Um I was about to say the National Labor Relations Board, but the um, the National Labor Relations Board. If it makes you feel any better, I sometimes get that confused with the version passed during the First World War, because I understand that some of these pieces of legislation tend to kind of repeat and overlap. But yeah, the National Labor Relations Board. And what's going to happen is organized labor is going to become more politically powerful, more politically significant. And that's a relationship you're going to see, especially throughout the Second World War. So the other major legacy of the New Deal is the fact that the federal government is born during the New Deal, weighing, and to a great extent, and I know I've mentioned this in class, the federal government pre-New Deal did not do too terribly much. The New Deal, the federal government had about 3% of GNP. But from 1932 to 1938, the federal government, as its spending as a total percentage of GNP. In other words, uh, let me back up for those of you who maybe are not really sure what GNP means. Basically, it means that before 1929, three out of every $100 spent in the United States. It is spent by the federal government. By 1932, that number rises to about $12 per every $100. And during 1944, sort of the peak of the Second World War for the United States, it's 40%. And you actually have what we would call the birth of the modern American welfare state. And you can actually see that to some extent in federal expenditures. I mean, this is kind of the legacy of the New Deal. And the chief irony here is that to some extent, you look at the Alphabet Soup program, Alphabet Soup, all of these federal agencies, and you go, "Gosh, what's the point, really?" And that sort of discussion extends to this day because everybody, really from Ronald Reagan onward, talks about cutting government. That government bureaucracy is too expansionist, that it's too interventionist, that it just needs to be cut down to size. But the irony is that when people talk about what to cut, they want to talk about, for example, maybe farm subsidies, or they want to talk about, incentives, or foreign aid, right? International affairs. But really, people seem to believe pretty genuinely, I think, that a lot of these items constitute the bulk of federal spending. And yeah, I guess all of this adds up. But if you really look at it, most federal spending is for entitlements. You're talking Social Security, unemployment, and you're talking Medicare and health. Oh, and by the way, the military, a whopping 16%. So really, over half of federal spending is on some form of entitlement. And the thing is, when you have a discussion on cutting this, I mean, and that's really what people have to do if one is really serious about cutting the national debt, etc. Um, Typically, the discussion goes something like this: we should stop sending money overseas, blah blah blah. Well, okay, that's 33.5 billion out of a total debt of some, I think it's up to 14 trillion something. Um, well, and they say, well, okay, well, what next? Well, you could cut Social Security and Medicare. Well, but people like those programs because that's generally going to be money in your pocket at some point in the future. Not everybody is okay with it, and but this was George W. Bush in his final years as president wanted to reform Social Security, and that reform movement uh, was kind of for a variety of reasons, but that push doesn't really get off the ground, or that movement doesn't really get off the ground because this is so embedded into our social fabric, and that's partially a consequence of the New Deal. Does the New Deal work, at least in terms of getting the United States out of the Great Depression? And the answer is obviously, I think quite obviously, no. But what it does do is it does change the ordinary citizen's relationship with government. And the best way to kind of tell goes back to this: the fact that whenever you get a paycheck, whenever receive income, you see government intervention in your paycheck. Now, of course, that's for better or for worse. Again, I try not to betray any particular political viewpoint. I'm probably not as successful there as I'd like to be, but the fact is that you can see the government in your daily life whenever you look at a W-2, whenever, because you're going to see where taxes come from. You're going to see where, excuse me, you're going to see where Social Security wages are extracted from. So this is something that is by and large a product of the New Deal. And this stuff right here is going to be a product of the Great Society in the 60s. So it's a radical redefinition of the role of government. And the other thing is that it does give Americans some degree of confidence that things can get better. But again, the ultimately what is going to bring America out of the Depression will be the Second World War.